Bankhead. I apologize. I think I delayed the stream a second there. I had hit it, but you have to hit it twice. And I looked away before the second connect to the stream button came up, so I apologize. But either way, what do we have here? We have Betsy, Bankhead. I threw out a little call there in the chat, like, if you're not here, it's your fault. And of course it is, but no, I'm kidding. Bible and the Trinity in Conflict, everybody. Sub-series, Read and Refute. Athanasius, part 1.2. Against the Gentiles. We'll get started here in just a few seconds. But whenever we do a live stream, I try to give people at least a few minutes. Sometimes people might not be prepared to join the live or focus. But if I give them a few minutes, then they might be able to get here. And so I don't want them to miss anything important. So usually on any live stream, I will give a 5-minute, at least 5 minute, right? Sometimes we start talking, or there's someone has an important question or something. Now tonight I'm going to try to keep this within 2 hours. So we're going to start here in just a couple minutes. I'll again wait a few minutes to give people a chance, but after that, we're going to get going. We're going to read Against the Gentiles, sections 11 through 20, maybe 21. We'll see how the timing works out. Right, we read 1 through 10 in part 1.1. And as we discussed, there were some things that were, of course, acceptable from the perspective of a Christian thinker. But there were a lot of things that weren't. Now I'm going to give just a brief review here in a second when I officially start, because I might, clip the first few minutes while we're waiting and give it a more formal presentation as part of the series. So either way, we'll see how it goes. And I'm going to review a list of things that were of concern, right? As we read the material and then as I listened to it again. And, I'm not going to provide specific references. I'm just going to say this is what we covered. At the beginning of each show, I'm going to briefly review the main issues with what we previously read. I might give a reference, but I'm going to, everything or anything I say in review of the prior show, you will hear me discuss as we read or read the prior section. So just watch the video and it's in those sections and it will come up as I read it. So, who else do we got here? Clay, good to see you. I know a lot of you have sent me emails, including Clay, but, and many of you, I apologize. I'm not always able to get to my communications. It's just the unfortunate consequence of being busy and having a lot of priorities right here that you don't always realize, but maybe I'm sure you could appreciate. And then I just get backed up, right? And then I have to do work. So the prioritization sort of really limits a lot of what I can do outside of these videos and the chat and stuff. But I do appreciate anyone's attempts, and I'll do my best. Again, it's just not always possible unless you're really someone, unless I'm seeing you or talking on a regular basis or we work together. There's just very little opportunity for me to do much more on a personal level. But who knows, right? We do cross paths here and there, different ones of us in our shared faith. So there's always opportunities for us to collaborate or work together or associate, but some of these things take time, right? And so I'll do my best to catch up, and until then, just consider it part of the time. Part of the time that we kind of get to enjoy just sharing biblical thoughts or reading problematic texts or documents by problematic people. And do our best to learn something from it, right? So to that end, I think it's time. Let's get going. Yes, Everett Commodore, always a pleasure to see you. So let's do this. Let me go ahead and just give an official review, intro, and we'll get started. And again, I may just leave that in. It's not a big deal, but depends, right? I try to do the best I can to make them look more formal, however possible. I think the audio is better. I'm still, once it gets unset, from the software settings to the mic settings to the speakers and all the camera and stuff. There's like several different, at least 4 that I can think of right off the top, and not including the manual adjustments, just the software stuff that has to be done for all the streaming and streaming software, and then the whole just arrangement for a video to come out. And if it gets messed up, it's like, oh, sounds not really something. I think in some were saying certain like StreamYard, you might be able to do something like that, but I don't use it, so we'll see. Either way, let's go ahead and begin, right? Part 1.2. Let's just get into it. It's the best way for you to see what's in there. And there's a lot we can use. Remember, this is not even close to what we're going to be dealing with in like 3 weeks or so, right? 3-4 weeks, within a month, right? Because we have this show. Then we have part 3 next week that will wrap up this against the Gentiles. Excuse me. Then I'll take a couple weeks off from this sub-series and do a couple videos probably in my CW Jaw Talk Idols series, the Bible and Idols. And maybe also a pre-Christian evidence Jesus is the biblical Messiah. I'm going to push the CW Jaw Talk videos over 50, right there. And I have more I want to do in those series. So then we'll come back, right, after just like a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks in between the end of this first document review and the beginning of the incarnation of the Word. Then we're going to have a lot of stuff to discuss, and we're going to talk about it all. In this early document, I'm not, going to be stopping a lot to break down everything we're reading. It's not necessary. I'll be reading and then summarizing and then just highlighting points like in part 1.1. That'll change when we get to other stuff, but there's still plenty here, and this is important. It's important, as you saw in part 1.1, but it's important that we understand some of the early thinking of Athanasius and how he talked to others, right? I think you'll see, especially in this part 1.2, you're going to see how he, I think, really sets himself up for later stuff we're going to get to. I realize I can always see how he'll see it differently, but I don't think there is much of a difference, if any difference. You'll see what I mean. The things he says against the heathen. Or the idols, and the Greeks and their use of idols as gods and stuff. Okay, let's get going here. Are you all set? Let's do it. Part 1.2, everyone. Let me just go ahead and get going here. All right. one more thing here. Okay, that's good. Welcome to the Bible and the Trinity in Conflict. Read and Refute, Part 1.2, Athanasius' work against the Gentiles or heathen. In Part 1.1, we reviewed the first 10 sections of this work by Athanasius, his first work, written around or in 318. Right before, as I talked about in Part 1, the Arian controversy really became an issue. And so the things that we're reading in this work that Athanasius is writing against the heathen or Gentiles, not against the Arians, right? He still has his thinking, right? Athanasius and any encounters or understanding he has developed to this point, with or without any awareness of the views of Arius, or how some were using the Bible like Arius in ways that didn't fully agree with his theology. A lot of what he's writing in this work against the Gentiles or heathen, especially as you're going to see tonight, but also in Part 1.1, I believe lays a foundation for a lot of what we're going to encounter in his writings against the Arians and in presenting his view about God and the Trinity. So even though everything we're reading isn't going to be packed with discussion material, it's still important because it will help you see the thinking of Athanasius going into the Arian controversy and these other writings we're going to get to. The next being the incarnation of the Word. We'll finish up this sub-series on the work against the Gentiles or heathen next weekend. And then we'll take a break for a couple weeks for a couple other videos and then come back to the series, start the incarnation on the Word. So these are important nonetheless because they're helping us understand his early view of God and understanding of it in comparison with the Greeks, their view of various gods. We saw in Part 1.1 that Athanasius presents something he believes is true about light and the sun, S-U-N, that it's like continuously extending from a source, that it has a cause, but you can see that for Athanasius, this cause really is just an extension from the source. This becomes much more developed later, but he brings it up in Part 1.1. It's not correct, however. As I explained, light is not a continuous extension from the sun. It's a particle, a wave, an aggregate of photons that exist as a wave that we see as light. I don't expect Athanasius to have known that at that time. I'm charitable, I try to be, right? It's not fair to criticize people for things they couldn't really have known in the way that we are criticizing them. He's still wrong. Okay, so that it still shows that regardless of whether he should have known better, it's still not correct. So for Trinitarians to use it today, they would only be then, I guess, using it to say visually that's the case. But it's not really the case, right? So things that are visually true but not actually true, are we using that now for biblical truth? Because the analogy of light from the sun is not used in the Bible for the Father and the Son. And so the Bible doesn't have to answer for the error of mistaking what light is. We can let Athanasius have a pass on not understanding the full scientific relationship of sun and light. We cannot give him a pass on using this analogy of what he observed and didn't fully understand to displace what is explicitly stated to be true in the Bible. And that's what's so interesting, because Athanasius, in the very opening section, right, in 1.3 of Against the Gentiles, read it and reviewed it in part 1.1 of this series, he says, the sacred and inspired scriptures are sufficient to declare the truth. Okay, well, so then these analogies and things that aren't in the Bible are used by him, as you're going to see, as if they are absolute truth. Now, he talks about in part 1.1, as we saw, and in the first 10 sections that we read of this work, he talks about how there are facts in nature that are evident and that we can use to establish divine truths. I think this is correct in many respects, right? Like life coming from life. So life has to be eternal, right? That's scientifically establishable and a divine truth. But his use of light from the sun is not correct. So I want to make this point because this is going to come up. This is something that's used to establish or help explain the Trinity and the relationship of the Father and the Son, and that has lingered to this day. So keep it in mind. Also, there were problems, of course, right? We some of these things, like with light and sun, or some of his views on the earth and the shape of the earth, these are a little bit, they involve our modern understanding of science in ways he doesn't fully have. And so we have to carefully express our criticism of his use of any of these things that are not true against what's in the Bible that's accepted as true, even by him. Right? Even he says the scriptures, the inspired scriptures, are sufficient to declare the truth. Okay, so we accept that as well. We have a little bit, not exactly the same documents in mind as him, but they're pretty close. And if we're using the accepted canon by that's true by Protestants and Catholics today, then we still have to deal with Athanasius as he understood text, though, right? So we want to be careful, and we want to be sure we don't criticize him for something he didn't use or accept. So, nevertheless, his premise of the scriptures being true and sufficient doesn't carry over, as you're going to see. And it may be why he lies. Like, literally, I have to say lies, right? How else can you view it? Unless he has a text that was just totally against what we accept as text, and that I think at that time and by that point, I just doubt that a text with the kinds of things he's talking about was available, right? Like he says that Adam's contemplating Eve's body is where things went wrong, right? And that's not true. God brought Eve to Adam, and Adam was very satisfied with her. And things were fine, right? It was only when the serpent went to Eve, it deceived her, and then she deceived Adam, or he fell for her and just was dumb, right? That things went wrong. So why is he saying that when Adam contemplated Eve's body, things went wrong? That's not what the records show at all. Well, I think it's because, like with his Trinitarianism, as you're going to see, he reads his own views into the Bible, right? So he's an aesthetic. You're going to see this regularly, and we saw it already in part 1.1. He does not believe in anything having to do with sensual pleasures. So when we read these accounts in Genesis and we see that that's not where things went wrong, that Adam contemplating Eve's body, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, that's her body. He's looking right at her. He realizes, okay, yeah, this for me is who I am. This part of what I am. Same thing, right? lustful contemplation. And so what are you talking about, Athanasius? Well, he's reading his aestheticism into the Bible. He's reading his rejection of, as Sam would call it, or refer to, or think of it as his lustful burnings, right? Athanasius is much more resistive to that than certain people. And so he's so much so, he's reading it into the Bible, totally redefining the account in Genesis. He also lies, right, about the serpent talking to Adam. That's nowhere presented in the Bible. He lies about Adam and Eve not being naked in terms of clothing. It's explicitly stated that's exactly what the case was in the Bible. I've done text readings on all these references in Genesis, by the way. So if you want like my thorough analysis of all these Genesis accounts, Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, all of it, take a look at those. My text readings, day text videos. He makes several incorrect statements about good and evil, right? We talked about that as existing things, right? He reifies the abstract, commits logical fallacies, and doesn't even do it consistently, right? He refers to good as something that's a real thing, but then he really just means it's real in the sense that God exemplifies it or shows it in the pattern of what he does. But evil's not like that, right? That it creates a problem for the Greeks or the heathen. They have to attribute that God created evil and all this stuff, right? None of which is true. Commits an either or fallacy, right? God can have a son, just like the Bible describes, right? We read the Bible. That's what is true, Athanasius. You said it yourself. Sacred inspired scriptures are sufficient. 1:3. Contra Gentiles. Okay? So we're going to hold that to you the whole way through this series, because you opened up your writings with it and we agree with you, and so there's no reason to allow you to get away with it. And yet you have all these other things that aren't in the Bible. They don't really show a commitment to following your own counsel or the text, of course, right? He says evil has no cause but only results from turning away from better things. Right? Well, the Bible refers to Satan as the father of the lie. And that refers to him as the cause of the lie. So I'm sorry, Athanasius. I appreciate your philosophical wanderings and speculations about things, but I'll go with the Bible, okay? Like all the other things that we've referenced already. And then Athanasius goes crazy, right? I mean, of course, all that shows signs of total abandonment of biblical loyalty. But then he says, it is not proper to admit women to deliberation about public affairs. That's at hour 1 and minute 45 of my part 1.1, the reading of his first 10 sections, Contra Gentiles. We're going to do sections 11 through 21 tonight, just like a second. I'm just giving you a quick review. But right there, right, that's against the Bible. The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible in no way provides a basis for that, and in fact provides accounts where women were and are very involved in public affairs. We have early records of Christians, like in Pliny the Younger's letter, where women actually used their homes as congregations for Christians and were persecuted and killed for doing so. If they can do all that, what do you mean they can't be involved in public affairs? Right? I mean, that doesn't follow anything in the Bible. Right? Romans 13, none of these things make a differentiation between men and women other than in the congregation. In the congregation, we have an arrangement that magnifies God above all else. We as men submit to the Christ, another man. We normally wouldn't do that, but we recognize he's the Son of God and is not a normal man. So we're doing what is against what we really might want to do. That may be true for women too, even though they were made to help us, right? It doesn't mean that they're low or being mistreated. If it does, well, then you're not a Christian. It means that they recognize men are taking the lead in this world where we're being persecuted for trying to do what's right. And we're going to work together and not against each other to try to have a good life and to get through it while we're being persecuted. Isn't it hard enough on us already? So why make it more difficult? A lot of people do. It's crazy. But we don't think that's appropriate. But Athanasius doesn't have a basis for anything other than a headship arrangement like what I just described in the Bible as well, from the Bible. That's what I'm talking about. God is the head of the Christ, Christ is the head of the man is the head of the woman. 1 Corinthians 11:3. The Bible doesn't speak about man doing anything but loving his wife. It even says we're really not to treat each other as men or women in the ultimate sense in which we need to help each other to get through this, right? We look beyond our differences. It's not that we're not men or women. We're just dealing with so much already. There are times when we have to just deal with each other. And yet we have Athanasius doing the opposite, right? I mean, he's like creating division right there between the genders, beyond what's in the scriptures that he says are sufficient. All right, let's get to the next part. Beginning with section 11. I think we're going to go ahead and do the, we're going to do the full text view. Come on, Dada. Got Dada here. I got two cats. One is named Dada. He's very active. You may come around or you may hear him doing something. But we try to pacify him so he's not too disruptive. So, which is usually the case. He's usually very good, right? So, thank you again, everybody. Just go ahead and say hello to people in the chat real quick. Betsy, TKS, Everett, Exile Reviews, Bankhead, Clate. Really good to see all of you. If I missed your name, I apologize. But let's go ahead and get to it. The full reading, I'll bring you all up. Right? So, in the edition I'm using, and I'm not sure if I put the link to this online version in part 1.1 or this part. I will after this show. But it's also readily available through a search on Google of the specific volume we're using, which is the Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers. I'm using here on the hard copy, second series, Athanasius, published by Hendrickson. But again, you can use the online version I have right here, and I will put the link below. So let's go ahead and read sections 11 through 20 or 21. I'll make some comments along the way. And we'll see what Athanasius has to say, picking up from our last reading. In the little, I guess let me move this over here so you can see this part at least. You can see this section heading up here. Gives you a little just kind of brief summary of what we're going to be reading. It says the deeds of heathen deities and particularly of Zeus. Okay. Go right here. But of these and such like inventions of idolatrous madness, Scripture taught us beforehand long ago when it said, the devising of idols was the beginning of fornication, and the invention of them, the corruption of life. For neither were they from the beginning, neither shall they be forever. For the vainglory of men they entered into the world, and therefore shall they come shortly to an end. For a father afflicted with untimely mourning, when he hath made an image of his child, soon taken away, now honored him as a god, which was then a dead man, and delivered to those that were under him ceremonies and sacrifices. Now, this just like at the end of our last video, part 1.1 on this read and refute, Athanasius against Gentiles. The reference is, he kind of quotes or begins to quote the book of wisdom right here. You can see in the footnote, which he refers to as Scripture, right? So the book of wisdom is was considered scripture by some, including Athanasius. The devising of idols was the beginning. Okay, we read that, right? He's quoting the Book of Wisdom. And in fact, he's still quoting it. Thus, in process of time, an ungodly custom grown strong, was kept as a law. This whole practice here of someone dying, right, like a child, making an image of a child, honoring him as a god, even though, just because of the fact that he's now under ceremonies and sacrifices, but previously was just considered his son. Thus, in process of time, an ungodly custom grown strong was kept as a law, and graven images were worshipped by the commands of kings. That crazy little thing, whom men could not honor in presence because they dwelt afar off. They took the counterfeit of his visage from afar and made an expressed image of the king, whom they honored. He's talking about how all the people go about making idols, what kind of is involved with it. And made an expressed image of the king whom they honored, to the end that by this their forwardness they might flatter him that was absent as if he were present. Also, the singular diligence of the artificer did not help to set forward the ignorant to more superstition. A lot of this here that he starts talking about, and really all throughout this part tonight, he really gets into the role of the carver, right? The one who's behind the design and actually shaping the idol from wood or stone, or a precious metal. And he talks about how, if you're going to worship the idol, why not the artificer? Why not the carver, right? The one that's really maybe the god is the one making the image. He really talks in strong terms about idols to the Greeks. We're going to find out his full views on idols as we read his entire works. But I just can't see at this point how what he's writing is going to be consistent with what we eventually get as part of his offspring, his spiritual, and even now to some extent perhaps, similar. No doubt, but not. Today it's I think off the charts, right? With all the idols and imagery, and even back here, right? We have Constantine. It's just hard to say to what extent fully Athanasius at this point. It seems like he's not, right? People change, things develop. You may, of course, with Constantine, a lot of problems with Athanasius later, as we'll see, but. There's no doubt here what he starts talking about and all the blame he starts kind of assigning to the artificer, right? Even here. Also, the singular diligence of the artificer did not help to set forward the ignorant to more superstition. For he, peradventure, willing to please one in authority, forced all his skill to make the resemblance of the best fashion. And so the multitude, allured by the grace of the work, right, they're so impressed by the idol, took him now for a god, which a little before was but honored as a man. This was an occasion to deceive the world, for men serving either calamity or tyranny did ascribe unto stones and stocks the incommunicable name. Again, I don't, a lot of this, the way he talks and the involvement of the artificer and how that goes toward the whole worshiping of idols, I don't see how that wouldn't turn around and apply to the Catholic Church or any church or Christian group that uses exactly what he's talking about. Any idol that an artificer would diligently fashion in a way that would basically cause people to revert it. And that's exactly what you Catholics, you Eastern, you Protestant, you all do. Some of you more than others. The Catholics and and the Eastern Orthodox, right? Protestants not so much, but even many Protestant groups, and the cross is all all over the place, right? None of that is from the Bible, everybody. No fashioning of those things or use of those things comes about until a long time later. And it's not those things, right? Like the first idols we'll see in our series, it's not really even an idol. It's more of a symbol, like the fish and certain letters. In any case, it sounds quite a bit like Athanasius is against using idols in worship. And I don't know that, I think by incommunicable name here, he probably means the name God, because God came to be a proper name, as I've talked about in my discussion of the divine name. And they weren't using it by this time, or certainly not Athanasius. And he talks about God as the incommunicable name elsewhere, as we saw in part 1.2, and we're going to see again later tonight, I think. So I wanted to point that out. The beginning and devising of the invention of idols having been, as Scripture witnesses, of such sort, it is now time to show the refutation of it by proofs derived not so much from without as from these men's own opinions about the idols. For to begin at the lowest point, if one were to take the actions of them they call gods, one would find that they are not only no gods, but had been even of men the most contemptible. Now, there's kind of I think there's some assumptions here, right? He's really telling the Greeks, look, the ones you think are gods, they're like terrible people. He's going to go on to talk about it. Contemptible, as he says here. So no gods. But that's sort of assuming, it is assuming, I guess, right? That gods can't be gods of things that are contemptible, or gods in ways contemplated by the Greeks. Now we'll go and get into this a little bit more as he develops this, but I don't know that I don't think he has a basis at this point, unless he's going to use the Scripture, right? Which he really doesn't in many cases, and the Greeks don't care about that, right? He starts out referencing the Scriptures, he starts out referencing facts about nature and what we see around us, right? Basically science. And now we're getting, you're not a god if you act contemptible, right? Does that fit with the Bible? I mean, doesn't Satan act contemptible? Sure sounds like, according to Jude, Michael the archangel found Satan contemptible. It sure sounds like Satan was contemptible in the book of Job when he was talking to God. That doesn't make him not a god. And even as we're going to see here, he really gets into this discussion of what's a god, what's not a god. He really highlights the fact that idols, they're not alive. Yeah, but as I pointed out, Trinitarians, Satan is alive. You even believe that. And he's referred to explicitly in the Bible as the god of this world or system. He's one of the sons of God, the sons of God appeared before God in Job, and that is an idiom in Hebrew meaning gods, which the sons of God are, according to God and the Son of God. Psalm 82, John 10. So, remember, we look to the Bible. Even Athanasius said, the Scriptures are sufficient, everybody. Okay. Well, then why isn't he using that as a basis for what is and what is not a god? Right? Obviously, idols in the Bible and Isaiah, they're not gods. There's no god. None of those are real gods. They may be used by real gods, right? Satan to mislead other people, right? Satan makes things, like even in Revelation in figurative terms, right? The image of the beast. And then, of course, there are many idols and all these beast-like groups, flags and emblems, and even religions, of course. So the fact is that it seems like demons and even Satan can and do use idols that are basically nothing. But then there are also idols and things that people just invent and start using, and like even their belly, right? Like the Bible says, considered a god by the devotion that they give to it, by the fact that their whole life is basically committed to that thing. Either way, I think there's some important assumptions here that we need to note, and we'll keep those in mind as we proceed. For what a thing it is to see the loves and licentious actions of Zeus in the poets. What a thing to hear of him, on the one hand carrying off Ganymede and committing stealthy adulteries, on the other in panic and alarm lest the walls of the Trojans should be destroyed against his intentions. What a thing to see him in grief at the death of his son Sarpedon, and wishing to succor him without being able to do so, and when plotted against by the other so-called gods, namely Athena and Hera and Poseidon, succored by Thetis, a woman, and by Aegeon of the 100 hands, and overcome by pleasures, a slave to women, and for their sakes running adventures and disguises consisting of brute beasts and creeping things and birds, and again in hiding on account of his father's designs upon him, right? He's talking about Zeus, or Kronos bound by him, or in the last case he was talking about Aegeon, or him again mutilating his father, talking about Kronos and Zeus. Why is it fitting to regard as a god one who has perpetrated such deeds, and who stands accused of such things which not even the public laws of the Romans allow those to do who are merely men? Okay, this is very important, right? Because he's basically said, why is it fitting to regard as a god one who has perpetrated such deeds? So in Athanasius's mind, everybody, just not doing what he considers good or appropriate or godly things means you can't be a god. No, that's not how the Bible presents gods. God isn't presented obviously as one who commits all these bad things, but they're in a different category though, right? God can kill whole nations of people. We can't. Right? So God can do things that involve a lot of things that the Greeks might say are just being mythologized or presented in ways, and he talks a little bit about this more later, but the Greeks, I think, could just say, look, these are just representations. We know there are differences. We know they're not really the god, the idol, and all that stuff, but they help us to see what we can't see. And a lot of what Athanasius says is either not supported by biblical facts or facts of nature, right? Because what in nature or what in the Bible would say you can't be a god and practice licentiousness or have desires, right? The sons of God are explicitly described in Genesis 6 as observing and desiring the daughters of men. So the direct sons of God, the spirits in heaven, who were there at the beginning of the creation of the earth, in the beginning, Job 38:7, exactly describes the creation of the earth just like in Genesis. Same beginning as John 1:1, where the Word was, Son of God. Jesus uses the text about the sons of God as gods in John 10 as his own defense about the question of whether he is a god. It can't be God because his use of the text involving the sons of God as gods. That's his defense. Either way, that's our view. Trinitarians don't quite see it that way. But here in any case, there's really no basis for his belief that evil deeds or conduct, immoral conduct from a human perspective would disqualify you from existing as a god. Right? Satan himself would be an example of that, as well as the other sons of God who came down according to Genesis and took the daughters of men. These are things that wouldn't fit with what he's describing. Now, I'm not saying he necessarily agrees with all that. We'll get to it, but right, we believe in the Bible. Even he said to do that, and so and whether he did or not, but we're going to hold him to it, right? So I don't think he's established that. And this whole comparison with the laws of the Romans, right, as a means of disqualifying gods who do similar things. Gods aren't subject to human laws. Not that I'm aware of. Right? I'm not aware that even in Greco-Roman thinking, that the gods were somehow bound to these exact same laws. And in biblical thinking, gods are not considered the same. Right? They already have knowledge. We took upon ourselves knowledge of good and bad and became like them. They were already that way. But there was no sin in the world. They were meant to be that way. We took that condition upon us before we were ready. So, I don't see anything in the Bible that says men are necessarily, I'm not saying that spirits and things, right, like lying or things, I'm not saying God or good spirits aren't bound by those kind of things, right? Obviously, Jesus doesn't approve of Satan being a liar, but their whole, right, look at how much latitude Satan has. He's allowed to do things way beyond what any of us could possibly do, right? He is able to enter in upon the council of gods in heaven, address God, challenge him, not his power, but his ways and those who worship him. So the idea that they're bound by the same laws as we are, I don't think so. Okay. So I don't think this really works for Athanasius if it were really argued properly from the Greek side. Either way, let's continue. Section 12, Other shameful actions ascribed to heathen deities all prove that they are but men of former times and not even good men. All right, let's take a look. For to mention a few instances out of many to avoid prolixity, who that saw his lawless and corrupt conduct toward Semele, Leda, Alcmene, Artemis, Leto, Maya, Europe, Danae, Antiope, or that saw what he ventured to take in hand with regard to his own sister, in having the same woman as wife and sister, would not scorn him and pronounce him worthy of death. For not only did he commit adultery, but he deified and raised to heaven those born of his adulteries, contriving the deification as a veil for his lawlessness, such as Dionysus, Heracles, and the Dioscuri, Hermes, Perseus, and Sotera. Who that sees these so-called gods at irreconcilable strife among themselves at Troy on account of the Greeks and Trojans, will fail to recognize their feebleness in that, because of their mutual jealousies, they egged on even mortals to strife. Who that sees Ares and Aphrodite wounded by Diomed or Hera, Adonius from below the earth, whom they call a god, wounded by Heracles, Dionysus by Perseus, Athena by Arcas, and Hephaestus hurled down and going lame. Right? He's talking about all these kind of human deficiencies and qualities that he doesn't think are fitting, right? He's saying recognize their feebleness, right? And that because of their mutual jealousies. So he's highlighting all these qualities and basically saying, right, this is not appropriate for individuals like that, for gods. Will not recognize their real nature, and while refusing to call them gods, be assured when he hears that they are corruptible and passable, that they are nothing but men, and feeble men too, and admire those that inflicted the wounds rather than the wounded. Or who that sees the adultery of Ares with Aphrodite? I find this interesting too, actually. This, while recognize their nature and while refusing to call them gods, be assured that they are nothing but men, right? A little highlighting right there. That's kind of like with Psalm 82, the gods there, right? This doesn't really fit, right? He's saying refuse to call those gods who are not, really gods, right? They're like men, like humans. They're nothing but men. Oh, what did I do right there? A little highlight there. Let's put that in green. So Why then would any Trinitarian then, if you're not going to follow Athanasius here, if you're going to, I should say, not that you have to, but note this here, Trinitarians, it doesn't fit with your belief that those who are called gods in Psalm 82, whom even the Dead Sea Scrolls say are spirits, and whom Jesus refers to as spirits in comparison to himself, they're not judges. They're not human judges. The human judges are never called gods outside the text you're assuming are calling them gods. That doesn't fit those who are called gods throughout that psalm, the whole book of Psalms, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in Jesus' use of that text in John 10. Or even in Athanasius' discussion here of those who are not gods, but men. And so what? That's exactly like I talk about also in my video comparing Old Testament text to Psalm 82 that show that men are not gods and gods are not men. Sometimes men can be appointed as gods, that's true, like Moses, but that's not how any human judges are described in the book of Psalms, nor what is the earliest Jewish understanding according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, and it doesn't fit the context of Jesus' use of it either. It just doesn't agree with your doctrine, and so here we are. Or that sees the adultery of Ares with Aphrodite and Hephaestus contriving a snare for the two, and the other so-called gods by Hephaestus to view the adultery and coming and seeing their licentiousness would not laugh and recognize their worthless character. Or who would not laugh at beholding the drunken folly and misconduct of Heracles toward Omphale, for their deeds of pleasure and their unconscionable loves, and their divine images in gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, and wood, we need not seriously expose by argument, since the facts are abominable in themselves. Well, yeah, well, you might want to come up with an argument, because, right, I mean, you're assuming they're abominable. The Greeks obviously don't see it that way, Athanasius. They clearly see these idols and images as representations of their gods, if not their gods. And so let's see what kind of facts you do provide, right? You're not gonna seriously expose by argument, since the fact, right, you're just assuming it's so obvious, right? Okay. And are enough taken alone to furnish proof of the deception, so that one's principal feeling is pity for those deceived about them. For hating the adulterer who tampers with the wife of their own, they are not ashamed to deify the teachers of adultery, right, referring to the alleged gods, and refraining from incest themselves, they worship those who practice it. And admitting that the corrupting of those children is an evil, they serve those who stand accused of it, and do not blush to ascribe to those they call gods things which the laws forbid to exist even among men. Yeah, but again, if it's not the law of the gods, they're not the same thing, and you can't apply one standard to both groups. All right, let's just take a quick look here, make sure you guys are doing okay in the chat. Purple Rain, nice to see you. Hey, maybe we'll get a pink moon tonight too, right? Looks like you guys are all having a good time there in the chat. All right, let's get back to our read and refute. Athanasius, part 1.2, against the Gentiles, heathen. To the next section. Section 13, the folly of image worship and its dishonor to art. All right, now again, I think there's a lot in here we can take with us into the next videos, but there's a lot here I think also applies to a lot of the idolatry we see in many groups today. So think of it in those respects as well. I think a lot of what he's saying against the Greeks applies to Christian groups who do the very same thing. Again, in worshiping things of wood and stone, and I understand, right, many Catholics, as they say, they don't worship these things, but he goes on to talk about veneration too, and not just the explicitly worship, because veneration does involve our worship. Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Protestants, you're all using idols, most of you, and especially all you Catholics, right? Eastern Orthodox, all you guys all over the place. You're using them in your worship, your houses of worship, your prayers, right? Everything. They're all over it. How can you focus on the Father in spirit and truth, not surrounded by images and idols and Oh, and repeating the same, all these things, right? Okay. So let's just see what Athanasius has to say. Again, in worshiping things of wood, they do not see that while they tread underfoot and burn what is no way different, they call portions of these materials gods. And what they made use of a little while ago, they carve and worship in their folly, not seeing nor at all considering that they are worshiping not gods, but the carver's art. Right? And I understand, again, Catholics, that you may say, well, we don't see Mary or these individuals, these saints as gods. You're using idols of these individuals. You can call them gods or no gods, right? He goes on and talks about how they can even be like intermediaries, like angels, and it's still not good. We'll get to it. But why are all these idols everywhere in the churches? Yeah, I do not. There's no biblical basis for it. We've talked about the Bible and idols. Video playing on the front page right now. The Bible does not justify all these statues and idols, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Protestants. That has to stop, right? Let's just go ahead and sweep all that away, right? All the idols, let's just break them apart, right? Like in the old days, the old times, biblical times, right? Good times. Let's break them down. Let's go ahead and sell them, the gold. Let's melt them down. All of it, Mormons, all of you. And give it to the poor. That is the way. The Watchtower, you actually come out looking pretty good where it concerns idols. That doesn't mean you don't have other forms of idolatry, but you go into a kingdom hall, you will not be surrounded by things looking back at you that are not actually alive. Not happening, right? So, credit to the Watchtower for not going full idol. Sorry, Catholics. They make you look ridiculous. So it's your choice. As long as the stone is uncut and the wood unworked, they walk upon the one and make frequent use of the other for their own purposes, even for those which are less honorable. But when the artist has invested in them with the proportions of his own skill and impressed upon the material the form of a man or a woman, then thanking the artist, they proceed to worship them as gods, having brought them from the carver at a price, bought them. Often, moreover, the image maker, as though forgetting the work he has done himself, prays to his own productions, and calls gods what just before he was paring and chipping. But were it better, if need to admire these things, to ascribe it to the art of the skilled workman, and not to honor productions in preference to their producer? For it is not the material that has adorned the art, but the art that has adorned and deified the material, right? All this applies to the Son. He doesn't, I don't think he sees it, right? All this right here is, I think it's going to come back, everyone. But were it better, if need, to admire these things, to ascribe it to the art of the skilled workman, and not to honor productions in preference to their producer. Well, who made the image of the Son, everyone? The Father. It's the Father's image. It's the Father's imprint. That's the Son. You don't honor the one who's the skilled workman, as you honor the workman's production. Just like you don't honor the things made through and prepared by the Son in the same way you honor the Son. All of this comes back. We're going to use it again later, everyone. For it is not the material that adorned the art, but the art that adorned and deified the material. Exactly. Only begotten God, everyone. John 1:18. It's God that adorned the Son and deified his material. Just like with his other sons. They're out of the Father. They're gods, sons of God. Just like Satan is. That's nothing to do with whether he's teaching what's right or wrong. Is he alive? Is he a direct son of God? That's a God. That's how it was understood in those times and in the Bible and in other literature. The B'nai Elohim are gods. It literally presents God in Psalm 82 coming into the council of God among the gods. who all throughout the book of Psalms, I have a whole video on it, the gods of Psalm 82, all throughout the Psalms, angels are called gods. Humans are never called gods. Jesus quotes that psalm in his own defense when the Jews accuse him of being theos, a god, because he keeps claiming to be the Son of God. They hear that, they understand that, and they associate it with how the sons of God are presented as gods. That's why they accused him of it. And his response is that, hey, doesn't it say, without breaking the scripture, I said you are gods. All of you sons of the Most High. Yes, it does. And we believe the scriptures are sufficient for truth. Just like Athanasius said, 1.3, only things don't stay that way. And even broke down, as we talked about in part 1.1, multiple times, right? Much juster were it then for them to worship the artist than his productions, both because his existence was prior to that of the gods produced by art, and because they have come into being in the form he pleased to give them. But as it is, setting justice aside and dishonoring skill in art, they worship the products of skill in art, and when the man is dead that made them, they honor his works as immortal. Whereas if they did not receive the daily attention, they would certainly in time come to a natural end. Or how could one fail to pity them in this also, in that seeing they worship them that cannot see, and hearing pray to them that cannot hear, and born with life and reason, men as they are, call gods things which do not move at all, and have not even life, and strangest of all, in that they serve their masters, beings whom they themselves keep under their own power. Nor imagine that this is mere statement of mine, nor that I am maligning them, for the verification of all this meets the eyes, and whoever wishes to do so may see the like. There's definitely assumptions going on here. I already mentioned several, and he's kind of just going with them. And so let's just go with it for this. He's just basically continuing this whole point of how it's doesn't make any sense to worship the products of skill and art when the man is dead that made them, right? So he's making some good points here, but I don't think he's consistent, and I think they all do spring from certain assumptions that could be argued that he's not correct in. 14. Image worship condemned by Scripture. Okay, Catholics, Protestants, all you pagans out there, all you who are Eastern Orthodox, you keep using these idols, and just come on now. Doesn't matter if Jesus was killed on a cross. No one told you to go running around wearing crosses and using crosses and just all these idols everywhere. And then we get to the Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. We're getting now into deep imagery, deep idols. All the stuff he's arguing against, right? But better testimony about all this is furnished by the Holy Scripture, which tells us beforehand when it says, their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. Eyes they have and will not see, a mouth they have, or have they and will not speak. Ears have they and will not hear. Noses they have they and will not smell. Hands have they and will not handle. Feet have they and will not walk. They will not speak through their throat, like unto them be they that make them. Nor have they escaped the prophetic censure, for there also is their refutation, where the Spirit says, they shall be ashamed that they have formed a God, and carved all of them that which is vain, and by whom they were made are dried up, and let the deaf ones among men all assemble and stand together, and let them be confounded and put to shame together. For the carpenter sharpened iron and worked it with an adze, which is like an adze, an A-D-Z-E. It's like a tool, kind of like a pickaxe, but like a longer, the picking part would be like a longer end of the back of a hammer, like the nail pulling part. And fashioned it with an auger. An auger is another like tool. It's the various types of tools for digging or other things. And set it up with the arm of his strength. And he shall hunger and be faint, and drink no water. For the carpenter chose out wood, and set it by a rule, and fashioned it with glue, and made it as the form of a man and the beauty of man, and set it up in his house. Wood which he had cut from the grove in which the Lord planted, and the rain gave it growth, that it might be for men to burn. And that he might take thereof, and warm himself, and kindle, and bake bread upon it. But the residue they made into gods, and worshipped them, and half thereof, or whereof they had burned in the fire. And upon half thereof he roasted flesh, and ate, and was filled, and was warmed, and said, It is pleasant to me, because I am warmed, and I have seen the fire. But the residue thereof he worshipped, saying, Deliver me, thou art my God. They knew not, nor understood, because their eyes were dimmed, that they could not see, nor perceive with their heart. Nor did he consider in his heart, nor know in his understanding, that he had burned half thereof in the fire, and baked bread upon the coals thereof, and roasted flesh, and eaten it, and made the residue thereof an abomination, and they worship it. Knowing their heart is dust, and they are deceived, and none can deliver their soul. Behold, and will ye not say, This is a lie in my right hand? How, then, can they fail to be judged godless by all, who even the divine scriptures are accused of impiety? Who even by the divine scriptures are accused of impiety, Or how can they be anything but miserable, who are thus openly convicted of worshiping dead things instead of the truth? Or what kind of hope have they? Or what kind of excuse could be made for them, trusting in things without sense or movement, which they reverence in place of the true God? All right, so he's really getting in it right there, right? We're halfway done, everyone. Let's keep going. Section 15. It was a little bit, we had one long section there with a couple short ones coming up, so let's keep going. Details about the gods conveyed in the representations of them by poets and artists show that they are without life, and that they are not gods, not even decent men and women. All right, let's pay attention here, because there's some things, again, I think they're going to carry over to our subsequent discussions. For would that the artist would fashion the gods even without shape, so that they might not be open to so manifest an exposure of their lack of sense. For they might have cajoled the perception of simple folk to think the idols had senses, were it not that they possessed the symbols of the senses, eyes, for example, and nose, and ears, and hands, and mouth, without any gesture of actual perception and grasp of the objects of sense. Right? So he's basically saying, it'd be better if you just didn't make anything, because you make them with these features, and we can see they don't work. Right? But as a matter of fact, they have these things and have them not. Stand and stand not. Sit and sit not. For they have not the real action of these things. But as their fashioner pleased, so they remain stationary, giving no sign of a god, but evidently mere inanimate objects, set there by man's art. Or would that the heralds and prophets of these false gods, poets and writers, had simply written that they were gods, and not also recounted their actions as an exposure of their godlessness and scandalous life. So he's basically saying, just refer to them as this god and that god, but don't tell us about their terrible life, right? Because then you're just proving they're not gods, according to Athanasius. For by the mere name of Godhead, they might have flinched away the truth, right? If they had just called them gods or God, they might have gotten away with it. Rather have caused the mass of men to err from the truth. But as it is, by narrating the loves and immoralities of Zeus, right, talking about all this stuff, and they're kind of humanizing them. And again, I think the Greeks could argue, or it could be argued, that a lot of these poetic works, and he does get into this a little bit more, but I want to mention it here. He doesn't specifically get into them being anthropomorphic or representations in ways that aren't actual, but that reflect things we understand. I think there is a more nuanced way that he's not really thinking of that could be, they could undermine what he's saying here. And then there are inconsistencies that are going to show up later with what he's saying here. Narrating the loves and moralities of Zeus, corruptions of youths, other gods, voluptuous, jealousies of the females, and fears and acts of cowardice and other wickedness, they merely convict themselves of narrating not merely about no gods, but not even about respectable men. Right? He's saying they're not only not gods, they're like terrible people. But on the contrary, of telling tales about shameful persons far removed from what is honorable. And again, he's using certain assumptions here to justify his thinking. But I think some of it you could probably understand or it makes sense, but it's really not reflective of a logical argument the way he's presenting it. Not in my, as I see it. Section 16, heathen arguments in palliation of the above, and 1. The poets are responsible for these unedifying tales. Are the names and existence of the gods any better authenticated? Both stand or fall together. Either the actions must be defended or the deity of the gods given up. And the heroes are not credited with the acts inconsistent with their nature, as on this plea the gods are. But perhaps as to all this, the impious will appeal to the peculiar style of poets, saying that it is the peculiarity of poets to feign what is not, and for the pleasure of their hearers, to tell fictitious tales, and that for this reason they have composed the stories about the gods. Right? So he's saying, maybe they would argue, well, we're not really writing all this stuff for you to take it all seriously, right? Not quite what I was saying earlier, but with it being taken literally, basically, is how Athanasius is saying they might reply. Don't take this like as how things really are. These are just stories. We're making it up. Fictitious tales. But this pretext of theirs, even more than any other, will appear to be superficial from what they themselves think and profess about these matters. For if what is said in the poets is fictitious and false, even the nomenclature of Zeus, Cronus, Hera, Ares, and the rest must be false. For perhaps, as they say, even the names are fictitious, and while no such beings exist as Zeus and Cronus or Ares, right, they're just there's figments, right, just things we're making up, people are making up. As they say, even the names are fictitious. No such being exists as Cronus, Zeus, Ares. The poets feign their existence to deceive their hearers. But if the poets feign the existence of unreal beings, how is it that they worship them as though they existed? Or perhaps once again, well, they could just argue, well, they exist apart from how the poets are describing them. Or perhaps once again, they will say that while the names are not fictitious, they ascribe to them fictitious actions. Right? Or as I say, they just kind of represent real actions. They're not actually how things are taking place, but they're just the best way they think we can see them or understand them. But even this is equally precarious as a defense, for if they made up the actions, doubtless also they made up the names. And that's not necessarily true. To which they attribute the actions. Or if they tell the truth about the names, it follows that they tell the truth about the actions too. And that's not true either. You tell the truth about the names and lie about the actions. In particular, they have said in their tales that these are gods certainly know how gods ought to act, and would never ascribe to gods the ideas of men, any more than one would ascribe to water the properties of fire. For fire burns, whereas the nature of water, on the contrary, is cold, right? We're getting some pretty interesting stuff here, right? Things that kind of will relate to, I believe, some stuff about Trinity when we're going to get into it. But actually, I would say we don't need that part highlighted. I might have to change it either way. In particular, they have said in their tales, these gods certainly know. These are gods certainly know how gods ought to act. How gods ought to act. That's kind of interesting, right? Where is he getting this? And remember, I mentioned this earlier when we started this 1.2, right? In section 11. He's assuming this morality, right, that would qualify or disqualify you as a god in his arguments against the Greeks, but which really aren't true. They're not. He hasn't established that sufficiently to make this kind of argument. It's assumed, at least in this work so far, the whole thing that we've read. This how gods ought to act thing, right? And it contradicts the Bible. The Bible doesn't present this, and the beings that the Bible presents as gods don't act as, holy figures all the time, and do act in ways that you might ascribe to humanity or ideas of men. right? He says you would never ascribe to gods the ideas of men. Well, I guess that depends, right? What kind of ideas are you talking about? Because gods like Satan lie. Isn't lie a sin? There's all kinds of things we could say that gods are beings like that, like I mentioned also with the sons of God. And then the gods who were princes over the nations, according to Daniel and other texts, right? Deuteronomy 32:8 in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They do things and act in ways that are manifest through the ideas of men, and they're not always non-existent idols, not according to the Bible. But then he tries to say, look, if they're gods, they're going to act like gods. But he doesn't really defend how that should be. He doesn't say, well, the Bible here in this account proves this is how gods should act. The Bible, in fact, has accounts that show gods act a lot of different ways. So this needs to be pointed out here, right? And he says you wouldn't ascribe to water the properties of fire, whereas the nature of water, on the contrary, is cold and fire burns, right? And yet we have Trinitarians who want us to believe that Jesus has two natures in one person that are opposing natures in the Bible. Flesh and spirit are spoken of in ways that are contrasted. The Egyptians' horses are flesh and not spirit. Or the Egyptians are flesh and not gods, right? Humans are flesh. So these two contrasts are made at different points in the Bible. Talked about it before, and you can look it up very easily by searching those words. This kind of contrast that he's talking about as well, that fits that, is not maintained in later Trinitarian thinking. Now, we'll see how much this plays a part in Athanasius' view, because it does. But let's just deal with what he says as we discuss it. If then the actions are worthy of gods, that they that do them must be gods. I can point to all kinds of actions we do in the image of God that don't make us gods, right? But we also do things that he would say don't make you God. So it's not just the actions that would make you God, right? You have to do it, display it perfectly in ways similar to the Son and the sons of God, right? But there's also this whole spirit aspect to being a God or a son of God or by nature God, in the ways that they exist as gods, whether they do what God says or not, right? Again, you can't be appointed a spirit, but you can be appointed God, according to the Bible. There's a difference, even though they're related in the sense in which the sons of God are gods, which is not true of humans. Although humans can act as gods, right? It's important to remember that. For their deeds must correspond to their natures, so that at once the actor may be made known by this act, and the action may be ascertainable from his nature. Yeah, but he doesn't find that. He says, if then the actions are worthy of gods, they that do them must be gods. If they are actions of men, and of disreputable men, such as adultery and the acts mentioned above, they that act in such ways must be men and not gods. So that would disqualify the gods of Psalm 82 from being human judges for sure, right? Because they're clearly doing the actions of disreputable men. They're being judged if they're men in that account, right? They're not. They're the angels over the other nations. But either way, this clearly is inconsistent with that. And there's, again, these things like adultery, or what we would consider adultery in a human sense, that does not apply, even in the pagan religions, as a law of the gods in ways where it's necessarily the same thing. And certainly could be argued, even if it was, that things are different in that sense. Or they're punished in different ways. But that wouldn't disqualify them from being gods. Where is he getting that? Where is he getting this idea that their morality disqualifies them from being anything but men? Only men can be disreputable, right? Right? You're disreputable. That's not biblical. So that just as a man discussing about water and fire and declaring their action would not say that water burned and fire cooled, nor if a man were discoursing about the sun and the earth would say the earth gave light while the sun was sown with herbs and fruit, but if he were to say so, would exceed the utmost height of madness. So neither would their writers, and especially the most eminent poet of all, if they really knew that Zeus and the others were gods. Invest them with such actions as show them not to be gods, but rather men, and not sober men. Or if, as poets, they told falsehoods, you are maligning them. Why did they not also tell falsehoods about the courage of the heroes, and feign feebleness in the place of courage, and courage in that feebleness? For they ought, in that case, as with Zeus and Hera, so also to slanderously accuse Achilles of want of courage, and to celebrate the might of Thersites, and while charging Odysseus with dullness, to make out Nestor a reckless person, and to narrate effeminate actions of Diomed and Hector. You gotta watch that effeminacy, Sam. We're noticing that, right? Prayers of Mary, Wayne Homo companies, right? That's not manly, right? He says right here, you're a heretical hero and manly deeds, right? He contrasts effeminate and manly, Sam. For the fiction and falsehood they ascribe to the poets ought to extend to all cases. But in fact, they kept the truth for their men, while not ashamed to tell falsehoods about their so-called gods. And as some of them might argue, they are telling falsehoods about their licentious actions. But that in their praises, when they speak of Zeus as father of gods, as the highest, and the Olympian, and his reign in heaven, they are not inventing but speaking truthfully. This is a plea which not only myself, but anybody can refute. For the truth will be clear in opposition to them, if we recall our previous proofs. For while their actions prove them to be men, right, he didn't prove that. He didn't provide any proof for that. It's what we're going to get, everybody. This happens a lot, but the two things are mutually inconsistent, for neither is it the nature of heavenly beings to act in such ways, nor can one suppose that persons so acting are gods, right? Contradicting the whole duality of their thinking of regarding Christ. And it's just incredible, right? A lot of what he's saying right here. It's in the nature of heavenly beings to act in such ways, nor can one suppose that persons so acting are gods. So once again, that would totally refute the Trinitarians' attempt to say the gods of Psalm 82 are actually humans. And you'd be saying the scriptures are mutually inconsistent, right? That's what he's saying right here. And then you get this whole duality, right, where the two natures of God and man are allegedly existing in one person, where you can actually know two opposing things at the same time. Which is the very type of madness he's refuting right here. Section 17. We're getting close to the end, everybody. This is about the truth probably is that the scandalous tales are true, while the divine attributes ascribed to them are due to the flattery of the poets. What inference then is left to us, save that while the panegyrics are false and flattering, the actions told of them are true? Panegyrics are like praiseworthy writings. So he's saying, what inference is left, save that the praiseworthy writings are false and flattering, and the actions told of them are true? The truth of this one can ascertain by common practice, for nobody who pronounces a panegyric upon anyone accuses his conduct at the same time. But rather, if men's actions are disgraceful, they praise them up with panegyrics, right? Written praiseworthy accounts. An account of the scandal they cause, so that by extravagant praise they may impose upon their hearers and hide the misconduct of the others. Just as if a man who has to pronounce a panegyric upon someone cannot find material for it in their conduct or in any personal qualities, on account of the scandal attaching to these. He praises them up in another manner, flattering them with what does not belong to them. So have their marvelous poets put out countenance by the scandalous actions of their so-called gods, attached to them the superhuman title, not knowing that they cannot by their superhuman fancies veil their human actions, but that they will rather succeed in showing by their human shortcomings that the attributes of God do not fit them. And I am disposed to think that they have recounted the passions and actions of the gods, even in spite of themselves. For since they were endeavoring to invest what Scripture calls the incommunicable name and honor of God, right? So I think right there again, to him, at this point, God has become an incommunicable name. I don't see evidence he's really thinking of like the Tetragrammaton or or even the trigrammaton or bigrammaton. Them that are no gods but mortal men, and since this venture of theirs was great and impious, for this reason and been against their will, they were forced by truth to set forth the passions of these persons, so that their passions recorded in the writings concerning them might be in evidence for all posterity as a proof they were no gods, right? He's basically saying, all these things you guys recounted just so we would all know for sure that they're not gods. All right, we're almost done, everyone. Section 18, just 2 more, or actually 3 more, including section 20. Let's just take a quick look, though. So everybody's doing. Good to see you, Betsy. Let me get that image in there. Good to see you, Flynn Holm, as well. We got a few Aussies in there, huh? All right, let's get back and finish this reading, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I do appreciate it. What defense, then, what proof that these are real gods can they offer who hold this superstition, right? He's talking about the Greeks and their pagan gods. For by what has been said just above, our argument has demonstrated them to be men. He thinks so, but, he's assumed a lot there. And not respectable men. But perhaps they will turn into another argument and proudly appeal to the things useful to life discovered by them, saying that the reason they regard them as gods is their having been of use to mankind. For Zeus is said to have possessed the plastic art, Poseidon that of the pilot, Hephaestus the smiths, Athena that of weaving, Apollo of music, Artemis that of hunting, Hera dressmaking, Demeter agriculture, and other arts, as those who inform us about them have related. But men ought to ascribe them and such like arts not to the gods alone, but to the common nature of mankind. For by observing nature, men discover the arts. And this is true, but it doesn't discredit the belief that it be from the gods either. He just says, well, it's from the human awareness of things, not the gods. Okay, maybe. But it doesn't prove it's not from the gods, though. Or even common parlance calls art an imitation of nature. That's true, again, but it still doesn't prove gods aren't behind a lot of the things in nature. If then they have been skilled in the arts they pursued, there's no reason for thinking them gods, but rather for thinking them men. For the arts were not their creation, that's assumed, but in them they, like others, imitated nature. That's assumed. It's possible, but he's not proving that, right? For men having a natural capacity for knowledge according to the definition laid down concerning them, that there is nothing to surprise us if by human intelligence, and by looking of themselves at their own nature and coming to know it, they have hit upon the arts. Or if they say that the discovery of the arts entitles them to be proclaimed as gods, it is high time to proclaim as gods the discoverers of the other arts on the same grounds, as the former were thought worthy of such a title. For the Phoenicians invented letters, Homer epic poetry, Zeno of Elea dialectic, Corox of Syracuse rhetoric, Aristaeus beekeeping, Triptolemus the sowing of corn, Lycurgus of Sparta and Solon of Athens laws, while Palamedes discovered the arrangement of letters and numbers and measures and weights, and others imparted various other things useful for life of mankind, according to the testimony of our historians. If then the art makes gods, right, that's not necessarily what they're saying, but, he's kind of dealing with it as if that's their argument. And because of them carved gods exist, it follows on their showing that those who at a later date discovered the other arts must be gods. Again, it depends. All right, if they just see the artist as being used by the gods to create the idol for them to have representation among humans, no. But if actually, as he's saying it, yes. Or if they deem these worthy of divine honor, but recognize that they are men, it were but inconsistent not to give even the name of gods to Zeus, Hera, and others, but to believe that they too have been human beings, and all the more so inasmuch as they were not even respectable in their day. Again, that doesn't prove you weren't a god. Satan is not respectable. And he's a god, even according to the Bible. Just as by the very fact of sculpturing their form and statues show that they are nothing else but men. No, it doesn't. But Men do sculpt things that are not gods. That's true. But just sculpting something as an image does not make it not a god. Section 19, 2 more to go, everyone. The inconsistency of image worship, arguments and palliation. The divine nature must be expressed in a visible sign. The image is a means of supernatural communications to men through angels. We got a few things coming up here that they're going to be important to keep in mind, okay? So if you're really with me and you want to understand Athanasius and what he's going to be talking about later, pay attention. I know it's not always easy. We're reading a lot, but that's what we're going to do. You want to know what's going on with this guy and what he was thinking, what this is all about? I do too. We're going to read it, and that's just that simple. From what other form do they give them by sculpture but that of men and women and of creatures lower yet and of irrational nature? All manner of birds, beasts both tame and wild, and creeping things, whatsoever land and sea and the whole realm of the waters produce. For men, having fallen into the unreasonableness of their passions and pleasures, are and unable to see anything beyond pleasures and lusts of the flesh, inasmuch as they keep their mind in the midst of these irrational things. Remember, he's an ascetic, right? Extreme rejecter of pleasurable things, physically pleasurable. They imagine the divine principle to be in irrational things and carved a number of gods to match the variety of their passions. For there are with them images of beasts and creeping things and birds, as the interpreter of the divine and true religion says. They became vain in their reasonings, going to the New Testament, and their senseless heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, changed the glory of the incorruptible God for the likeness of an image of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things, where God gave them up unto vile passions. For having previously infected their soul, as I said above, with the irrationalities of pleasures, they then came down to this making of gods, and once fallen, they're thenceforward as though abandoned in their rejection of God. Thus they wallow in them, and portray God the Father of the Word in irrational shapes. Right? So he's saying all these idols are of God the Father of the Word. I find that kind of interesting. Why would he say that? Why would it always be God the Father that he's saying these shapes represent? They're portraying God, the Father of the Word, in irrational shapes. Why couldn't it be the Word in irrational shapes also? As to which those who pass for philosophers, I don't see where he's getting that that's the only person who all these idols are being patterned after, right? I think he's just assuming that also. As to which those who pass for philosophers, and if so, why? Why would it have to just be the Father if the others are also equal in the Godhead? As to which those who pass for philosophers and men of knowledge among the Greeks, while driven to admit that their visible gods are forms and figures of men and of irrational objects, say in defense that they have such things to the end that by their means the deity may answer them and be made manifest, because otherwise they could not know the invisible God, save by such statues and rites. So kind of saying that they're basically saying this is kind of how we know them. Similar to what I was getting at earlier in the whole anthropomorphic representation. He's going through kind of a series of potential replies or actual replies that Greeks could give to justify their use of idols as gods or gods behind these idols. So he says, well, those who profess to give still deeper and more philosophical reasons than these say that the reason of idols being prepared and fashioned is for the invocation and manifestation of divine angels and powers, that appearing by these means they may teach men concerning the knowledge of God, and that they serve as letters for men, by referring to which they may then learn to apprehend God from the manifestation of the divine angels affected by their means. Such then is their mythology, so far be it from us to call it a theology. But if one examine the argument with care, he will find that the opinion of these persons also, not less than that of those previously spoken of, is false. Right? We'll see if he gets into it, but it doesn't, in this section at least, talk at all about how they're using these so they can know the invisible God, right? Say by these rites and statues. Why is that not appropriate for them to do? Where's his refutation of that? Let's see. This is our last section, everybody. Section 20. But where does this supposed virtue of the image reside? In the material or in the form or in the maker's skill? Undeniably, all of these views. For one might reply to them, bringing the case before the tribunal of truth, how does God make answer or become known by such objects? Is it due to the matter of which they consist, or to the form which they possess? For if by it be due to the matter, what need is there of the form? Instead of God manifesting himself through all matter, without exception, before these things were fashioned, right? He's saying basically, if it's the material that's so important in manifesting God, then why do you have to make an image? And so he says, and in vain they have built their temples to shut in a single stone or stock or piece of gold when all the world is full of these substances, right? So you've got all the substances, why do you have to do anything with them if the substance is what's so important in manifesting God or helping you appreciate God or come to know God? But if the superadded, right, addition, added upon something added, form be the cause of the divine manifestation, what is the need of the material, gold, and the rest instead of God manifesting himself by the actual natural animals of which the images are the figures? In other words, if it's so important to have these carved images for God to be manifest, well, why doesn't he just manifest through the actual living things? Well, maybe they do, but it's a lot harder to keep those things around and hope that the gods manifest through them than to make an image and use it as a means of manifesting or coming to know the God behind that image. So again, I just don't see that what he's saying here is a good argument. There's just because you can manifest as an actual living thing and not the image. If the image is important, right, in the Bible, God has images of things in the tabernacle and on the ark. That doesn't mean we're to make all kinds of idols and stuff. It's something he said to make, like with the copper serpent. But then when later the copper serpent he told the Israelites to make was used for other purposes, that was bad. So if you're doing what God says to do, fine. But if you're not, then that's not good according to the Bible. And so I don't see why just because these gods can manifest behind actual living animals would mean they couldn't also use the statues of those animals to come to know or worship the gods. It, to me, doesn't, maybe some means of persuasion there, but this is not a really great argument in my opinion. For the opinion held about God would on the same principle have been a nobler one. Were he to manifest himself by means of living animals, whether rational or irrational, instead of being looked for in things without life or motion, wherein they commit the most signal impiety against themselves. For while they abominate and turn from the real animals, beasts, birds, and creeping things, either because of their ferocity or because of their dirtiness, yet they carve their forms in the stone, wood, or gold and make them gods. But it would be better for them to worship the living things themselves rather than to worship their figures in stone. Okay, but that doesn't mean you still can't worship them in stone from the Greek perspective, right? Again, I don't see this as an invalidating argument. It may provide some other way, right? Yeah, well, if you worship the image of the bird, of a hawk, why don't you just follow the hawk around and worship it? Well, because it's not as easy to do that. And I can make a hawk and use it in the way, if you're a Greek, right? So I'm just saying, again, I'm not persuaded by a lot of what he's saying. Even if I agree with it, it's just not a well thought out, in my opinion, argument. But perhaps neither is the case, nor is either the material or the form the cause of the divine presence, but it is only skillful art that summons the deity, right? So not the material, not the final carved image, but the one who made it, who designed it, inasmuch as it is an imitation of nature. But if the deity communicates with the inmates on account of the art, what need, once more, of the material, since the art resides in the men? Again, I agree, right? Why do we need an image, everybody? Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Protestants, what's all with all these images and things? What's going on here? Because not only does the Bible warn us against idols, even Athanasius is saying, look, what's the point? If the material isn't the special thing, if the carved image isn't the special thing, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And then he says, okay, if it's the artist, then it would be he says the deity communicates with the inmates on account of if he does that, if he communicates with the inmates, once more the material, since the art resides in the men. For if God manifests himself solely because of the art, and if for this reason the images are worshipped as gods, it would be right to worship and serve the men who are masters of the art. Right? So the men are these inmates, right? God's communicating to on account of the art in this situation. And he's saying, okay, if God communicates with the inmates about the art, what do we need of the material? Because the art's in the men. And if God manifests himself solely because of the art, and for this reason the images are worshipped, it would be right to worship and serve the men who are the masters of the art, right? So instead of making an image, worship the men whom God made the artist, inasmuch as they are rational also and have skill in themselves. So I think all of this can be used against the practice of use of idols in worship today by many groups connected with Athanasius in this period of time. Not necessarily they were saying they were all in agreement, but I think either way, even if Athanasius ended up doing these things, it's inconsistent with what he's saying here. We'll talk about it. And I don't agree even with this here, right? If God manifested himself solely because of the art and the images are worshipped as gods, it would be right to worship and serve the men who are masters of the art, inasmuch as they are rational also and have skill in themselves. But if the images or idols are being used to represent the gods who gave the skill to the men to be artists, why would we have to worship the men to whom the gods gave the skill? You wouldn't. Again, it's a bad argument, everybody. It doesn't work. Again, think about it. If you're using an idol to represent a god, and Athanasius is saying, okay, well, the idol's material and the idol's carved image are not of any inherent value. And so is it the artist? Is it the fact that the artist created the idol that you're so impressed by, that you think it's the god? Well, God gave to the artist the ability to make it. So if God's manifesting in the artist, why are you worshiping the idol and not the person who made the idol? Why couldn't the Greek just say, because the person isn't the God represented by the idol? I'm worshiping the God represented by the idol who gave the artist the ability to make it. And that's why I don't believe his argument is good here. And he makes several bad arguments, I think, throughout this entire section that we have read in this part 1.2, everybody. We'll pick it up right here in section 21, the idea of communication through angels, involving yet wilder inconsistency. And we will try to wrap up this series. So we'll have a little bit longer show in part 1.3. And this is where we will begin, where that is concerned. I'll put a link to this below in case you want to follow me online and you don't have this specific link. But we're one show away from finishing Athanasius' work, and he's given us a lot to consider, especially in part 1.1 in terms of his overall view of the scriptures and handling of the scriptures. But even here in part 1.2, right, numerous assumptions about things he has not established, things that seemingly will work against him later, right, when we get into discussions about gods and the Word is God and Father and all this stuff. It's all going to come back. So even though it's not like fully full of all that stuff, I'm going to be referring back to this frequently just to show comparisons and development in thinking. And of course, there are many other things that we saw that are important to remember as we go further into our series about early Christian writers at this point, but that will also develop further into a discussion of later writers. But we're going to spend quite a bit of time here in the Nicene period and review and refute, right? Read and refute, as is the name of this subseries of the Bible and Trinity and Conflict. All these early heretical writers that were bringing up issues and claiming things about the Bible that are not true, lying about things presented in the Bible as literal, claiming they're figurative, claiming people talk to people that didn't talk to people, or that appreciation for the female body was so bad that it caused the downfall of everything, which is not true. A lot of reading into the scripture, personal beliefs, misuse of analogies, sun, light, and then just a really poor level of argumentation overall in tonight's reading, right, where he's trying to undermine the Greeks' arguments about the idols being gods or of value at all. Some things he says are useful based on the Bible, but a lot of what he says doesn't follow, even though he says it does. And he's failed to establish in many cases what is actually the kind of morality he claims is proper for a god, and which would disqualify you, from being one. So I hope that was enjoyable for you. I look forward to joining you again next weekend. Next Saturday, we will do Christian Witnesses of Jah live discussion number 16, Saturday night, 8 o'clock California time. And then next Sunday, we'll finish up our read and refute opening review of Athanasius' first work, Against the Gentiles or Heathen, before we move on to his work on the incarnation of the Word. So I thank you all for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, or evening, and may Jah bless you. In Jesus' name.